Hello Flight Simmers and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. During the next several videos, we'll be taking an in-depth look at instrument approaches, which is what you spend the bulk of your time practicing during your instrument training. To make this topic a little easier to digest, the next few videos will focus on some of the procedures you need to know how to fly to be able to successfully execute any approach you encounter. In this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at procedure turns. So what is a procedure turn? A procedure turn is a maneuver that's used when it's necessary to perform a course reversal to establish the aircraft inbound on the final approach course of an instrument approach procedure. In fact, in many non-US countries, it's actually just called a course reversal instead of a procedure turn. It's most commonly used when an aircraft is approaching the field from the opposite side of where the approach course is located. It can also be used to lose altitude as a pilot transitions from the en route to the approach environment, and it can be performed by a pilot using their own navigation. In other words, there's no need for air traffic control assistance in the form of radar vectors, and in fact, you don't even have to be in a radar environment. So an example of some place that I might want to use a procedure turn, we're looking at the VOR approach to runway 18 at Corpus Christi International in Corpus Christi, Texas. The identifier for the airfield there, the ICAO, is Kilo Charlie Romeo Papa. Let's assume that we're taking off using one of the south-facing runways here in Corpus Christi. We're just going up to do some instrument training, so we want to practice some approaches. So what we're going to do is take off and fly to the south, and then the best way for us to get on this approach, in fact, the only way for us to get on this approach using our own navigation and not radar vectors, which can be somewhat problematic in Flight Simulator, is to turn around to the north after we get to a safe height and fly directly up to the Corpus Christi VOR. You can see this is labeled as an IAF, which means the initial approach fix. This is the initial approach fix for this approach. What we do once we hit that fix is we are going to fly outbound on the inbound course, and then we will execute this procedure turn, which will turn us around and have us flying inbound on the course, and then we can fly the approach on in from there. A procedure turn is depicted with a barb symbol on government charts, and on JEPISA charts it's basically depicted as it's usually flown. It's a fairly simple maneuver to fly, and there's more than one way to do it. The most common method is to navigate to the fix where the turn starts, which is usually an initial approach fix for the approach, labeled IAF on the chart. Once you reach that fix, you want to fly outbound on the inbound course, typically for 2 minutes, though you may want to use 1 minute for a faster aircraft. Once you reach the 2-minute mark, you want to make a 45-degree turn in the direction depicted by the barb. The heading you want to fly on this segment is depicted on the bottom side of the barb symbol. Once you've established yourself on this heading, you want to fly it for 1 minute. This leg is called the outbound leg of the procedure turn, or procedure turn outbound. At the end of that minute, you want to make a 180-degree turn in the opposite direction. The heading you want to fly on this segment is depicted at the top of the barb. This is the inbound leg of the procedure turn, or the procedure turn inbound. You fly this heading until you intercept the inbound course, which should take about a minute in a zero wind condition. It's useful to time this leg as well, since you're on a sharp 45-degree intercept of the inbound course. So timing it will let you know when you're getting close to the inbound course. Once you intercept the inbound course, you can fly the rest of the approach as depicted. And again, we'll be doing a detailed look at the procedures for flying many different types of approach procedures in the next few videos on this channel. There are also vertical or altitude elements to a procedure turn, and these are depicted on the profile view of the approach chart. This is a little box that's underneath the map view or plan view area that's a view of the approach as viewed from the side and depicts the altitudes used on the approach. There will be an altitude at the farthest point away from the runway on the profile view, with a course line running from the fix where the procedure turn starts to that altitude. This indicates that once you cross the fix and fly outbound on the inbound course to start the procedure turn, you can descend to the altitude at the end of this course line if you've been cleared for the approach. For example, let's say that we've taken off from Corpus Christi off of the south runways. Once we got airborne and got radar contact, they cleared us to climb to 3,000, proceed direct to the Corpus Christi VOR, and told us that we were cleared for the VOR to runway 18. So once I navigate directly up here to Corpus Christi VOR and establish myself on the 012 radial flying outbound to set up for the procedure turn, once I cross that VOR, and I have been cleared for the approach, then I can descend down to 2,100 feet. There's also a course line that points back to the runway in the opposite direction with an altitude just before the big X or Maltese cross that identifies the final approach fix on this approach. This indicates the altitude that you can descend down to once you're established on the inbound approach course. So again, using this VOR to runway 18 as our example, we have established ourselves outbound. We come out here for 2 minutes. We fly the 327 heading for a minute. We turn around 180 degrees and fly that 147 heading. We intercept the 012 degree radial and then start flying it inbound on a 192 heading. And once we're established on that radial, we know we can descend from 2,100 feet down to 1,700 feet. As you make your way through each leg of the procedure turn, you want to do what we call the 5 T's, and these are going to carry over to approaches as well. The 5 T's are time, turn, twist, throttle, and talk. The time is remembering to start or reset your timer to time each leg of the procedure turn that you need to time. Turn is remembering to turn to the appropriate heading for that segment. Twist is remembering to twist or adjust your OBS course selector if you're using a VOR to the appropriate course so you get correct sensing. Throttle is remembering to reduce your throttle to descend to the appropriate altitude for that segment. And then talk, we are not going to use as much in Flight Simulator, but this is to notify ATC if necessary in the real world. A lot of times they will ask you to advise procedure turn outbound, procedure turn inbound, or established on the inbound approach course. And so this is to remember, to help you remember to key up and do that. So let's go ahead and talk through the way that we would fly this for this particular approach here at Corpus Christi. So let's assume that we are taking off from, we'll just say runway 18 in Corpus Christi. We've been cleared to 3,000 feet. We comply with any departure procedures that they have in Corpus Christi. We'll assume that once we get radar contact, we get the following clearance from ATC. They say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact, climb maintain 3,000 feet, turn left direct to Corpus Christi VOR. Then they'll probably pause to let us digest that and read it back. And then once we get all that, they will say proceed direct Corpus Christi VOR, maintain 3,000 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the VOR, runway 18, Corpus Christi. So at that point, we will go ahead and turn and navigate direct to Corpus Christi VOR. And then once we hit the VOR, that's where we want to start doing our 5 T's. So for the first leg of the approach, we want to time. So we'll start timing for 2 minutes. We want to turn to intercept this 012 degree radial outbound. We want to twist our OBS to 012, and that will give us correct sensing to track this radial outbound. Throttle, we want to go ahead and throttle back and descend to 2,100 feet. And then we probably wouldn't talk at this point. They probably, unless they advised, told us to advise crossing Corpus Christi VOR, there would be no need to talk there. So once you've reached that 2-minute turn, it's time to turn outbound. So we'll do our 5 T's again. We'll reset our timer back to 0 so that once we get on that 327 heading, we can start timing for 1 minute. We want to go ahead and turn to that outbound procedure turn heading of 327. We want to go ahead and twist our OBS. Once we make that turn, we'll twist it over to 192 on the course selection so that we get correct sensing as we're tracking the 012 degree radial inbound once we intercept that course. Throttle, we're not going to do anything with the throttle on this segment. We're already at 2,100 feet and we don't want to go any lower until we get established on the approach course inbound. and then talk. If they told you to advise procedure turn outbound in the real world, that's once you're established on that heading, you would key up the mic and advise them of that. And once you reach that 327 heading, don't forget to go back to your timer and start that time for that 60-second or 1 minute outbound leg. Once you get to that 1 minute, then it's time to hit those 5 T's again. We'll go ahead and reset our timer so it's back to 0. We'll go ahead and turn to that 147 degree heading. We'll go ahead, and if we haven't already, go ahead and twist that OBS to the 192 course. That gives you a second chance to catch that if you didn't do it on the first time around. Throttle, again, we're not going to descend until we're established on the approach course inbound, so we don't need to do anything there. Talk, once we're established on that 147 degree heading, we would key up the mic if they've asked us to advise procedure turn inbound, and we would let them know that we're established on the procedure turn inbound. And then it is a good idea, once you have reached that 147 heading, go ahead and hit the timer again. It's not absolutely necessary, but it will give you kind of a heads up of when the course is going to come alive. We're probably not that far from the VOR, so things are going to be fairly sensitive, and the needle will swing across fairly quickly. And having that timer up there kind of gives you a heads up as to when that needle is going to start swinging in and when you need to start turning to get on that inbound course. And once we have intercepted the inbound course and started flying inbound, we'll hit those 5 T's again. Time, we don't need to do anything, just reset our timer so it's at 0, so that if we're timing this approach, our clock is ready for that. Turn, we turn to intercept the inbound course. Twist, you should already be twisted to the 192 course. You've had a few chances to do that now. Throttle, we can't go ahead and throttle back and descend down to 1,700 feet in preparation for flying the final approach. And then talk, if they advise us established to advise, if they've asked us to advise established on the approach course inbound, we go ahead and key up and tell them that at this time. From here, you just are flying the rest of the approach. And again, we're not going to talk about actually flying the approach today. We'll have a series of videos where we talk about actually flying approaches and all the different types of approaches we can fly and how to fly those. So let's go ahead and hop in the airplane, and we will take off from Corpus Christi, and we'll actually go out and we will fly this procedure turn and see what it looks like in the aircraft. So a little side note here, I got pretty deep into production on this video when I found out that Corpus Christi is missing runway 1836 in Flight Simulator, despite it having been constructed around 1990. It's just a big blank piece of pavement in Flight Sim, and there are no instrument approach procedures for it in the database for the in-game GPS units like the GNS 530 or G1000. You can get a mod at flightsim.to that adds the runway to the airport, as well as making some other fixes to the airport layout, and I'll leave a link to that mod in the video description. The mod, however, does have the unfortunate side effect of deleting all instrument approach procedures on the in-game GPS receivers. None of this really matters for this lesson. The VOR is still in the right place, and we can still fly this procedure turn exercise without changing anything. Just be aware that if you don't install the mod, runway 18 won't be there, so you won't be able to set yourself up on that runway for takeoff, and if you finish the procedure turn and want to attempt the approach, you'll break out to a blank piece of concrete with no lighting of any kind. If you do install the mod, you'll get a nicely rendered runway and its associated lighting, including approach lights, but you'll lose all instrument approaches for the airport in the GPS units. So if you want to come back and fly something like an RNAV approach, you'll need to delete the mod. You'll still be able to fly any of the non-RNAV approaches at the airport with the mod installed. You just have to use raw data, and you won't be able to load those approaches in the GPS. So as far as the setup for the flight, we will use the Cessna 172, the Steam Gauge Edition, or the Classic with the GNS 530 and 430 on board. As far as weight and balance goes, we'll stick with full tanks of gas and then 2 170-pound passengers. And then as far as the location goes, we will do Corpus Christi. Identifier is Kilo Charlie Romeo Papa. I do have it set up for takeoff to runway 13. You can see I do have the mod installed, so runway 18 is available if we want to use that. It doesn't really matter. Either way, you're going to take off and get to the appropriate altitude, and then we'll turn up to the north and head directly to the VOR. As far as environmental conditions, we will set it up for a mid-June day around noon, and we'll set that with the clock down here, since that is the one that works for setting time. And that should have us set up for equipment, airport, and time and date. Then we'll go in and we'll set up the weather conditions. Okay, so we've moved out to the runway 13 at Corpus Christi. A couple other things that we have set up here with the weather. I've put the altitude calculation at AMSL. I've put the temperature at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which gives us about 21 degrees Celsius here at the surface. We have a standard pressure of 2992, humidity of 1. And we don't have any wind layers in there, so we're doing this with calm winds, which is what I recommend for your first flight practicing. This is to do it in a zero wind condition, then you can add in some crosswinds if you want to do that. As far as the cloud layer, I do have adjusted this lowest cloud layer, so I have the coverage set to 100%, density set at 0.5. That'll give us about a mile visibility if you want to try to get back in on the approach. The scatter I still have set at 0. The top's up about 10,000 feet. That should keep us in the clouds and keep us in IFR conditions while we're flying this procedure. And then I put the bottom altitude of the cloud at about negative 300 feet. This is 1,000 feet under the minimums for the VOR approach, which is 700 feet or 654 feet above the ground. So that will give us good minimums. This is a good setup for breaking out at about that altitude if we want to fly the approach. And I'm going to demonstrate this in the Cessna 172 Classic, but the procedure is basically the same for both this and the G1000 edition. So a few things I'm going to set up before I start my takeoff run. I'm going to go ahead and move the timer over to the elapsed timer, so I have a timer that I can use to time the legs on the procedure turn. I've got my heading bug rolled around there to the runway heading, so I don't have to mess with that once I get airborne. I do have Corpus Christi VOR dialed up in the number 1 nav, and I need to switch that over to the VOR, so it says VLOC up here and VLOC down here, so we're not looking at the GPS there. I'll also flip this over to another page here so we don't have a cheater map to look at, so we're doing this all by raw data. I did preset my altitude of 3,000 feet in the autopilot. And then we'll assume that we filed a flight plan, an IFR flight plan, and the route of flight was Corpus Christi Airport, direct to Corpus Christi VOR, and then back to Corpus Christi Airport. So as we're taxiing out, or before we taxi out, we call up and we get a IFR clearance. We'll assume we get the following clearance. Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you're cleared to Corpus Christi as filed. Climb and maintain 3,000 feet on departure fly runway heading, squawk 5502. So we read that back, we taxi out. We get into position on runway 13, and then we get our takeoff clearance. They tell us Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, runway 13, fly runway heading, you're cleared for takeoff. And so with that, we are ready to launch. You can perform a normal takeoff from runway 13, and there are no special departure procedures for runway 13 or 18 in Corpus Christi, so you can safely make a turn when you get to 400 feet above the airport. So we'll assume that when we get handed off to departure, they say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact, climb maintain 3000, when able make a left turn direct to Corpus Christi VOR. Once we get established on course, tracking to the VOR, ATC issues the following clearance. Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, maintain 3000 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the VOR, runway 18 at Corpus Christi. So with that, we now have clearance to perform the procedure turn and fly all the altitudes associated with it. Alright, so we are climbing up through 2,700 feet. We will be leveling off at 3,000 feet here in just a second. And we are navigating direct to the Corpus Christi VOR, currently about 5.7 nautical miles away. And once we get there, we'll start our procedure turn. And once you level out at 3,000 feet, go ahead and run a quick cruise checklist. It is okay to fly this entire maneuver at your cruise speed. About 105 knots on the Cessna 172 will work out just fine. So once you get to the cruise altitude, just run that quick cruise checklist and you can continue to maintain your cruise airspeed. I'll also mention that it's fine to use the autopilot if you want to do this, or you can try to hand fly it if you want to. Personally, I think if you're learning the procedure, it's fine to use the autopilot to learn how to fly the procedure, but if you want the challenge of hand flying while performing the procedure, you can do that as well. And that goes for most of our instrument approaches. Oftentimes, I think it's good to learn the approach by flying it with the autopilot first, and then once you kind of have the technique down, once you have the theory behind how you're supposed to fly it, then if you want to move to hand flying the approach, then you can move on from there. So I'm coming up on 1 mile DME away from the station. I've got the autopilot in heading mode, and I'm just using small heading changes to keep the CDI centered up. And remember, as you get closer to the VOR, it will get more sensitive. And then once I get this flip from the to to the from flag, that's my signal to go ahead and start my 5 Ts for that outbound leg of the procedure turn. So 0.2 miles, getting very close. Looks like we're going to cross pretty much right over the station here. There, the CDI starting to wander. We've got the flag flip there. Goes from a to, looking for the from. There it is. So I'll hit my 5 Ts. I'll start the timer. It's counting up. I'll turn 012. That's about where I am right now. I'll twist. I'll go ahead and twist to a 012 on the heading. And I'll put just a little bit more of a turn to go and intercept that course. Then I will throttle. I need to go down to 2,100 feet. So I'll go ahead and put in 2,100 feet, and I will use a vertical speed mode of about 500 feet per minute to get down there and reduce the throttle so I don't overspeed there. And then if they had asked me to report crossing Corpus Christi outbound, then I could call up and let them know that I was doing that. So that's my 5 Ts there. So now we will just track this outbound course from the VOR out 2 minutes, and then we'll start the next stage of our procedure turn. All right, there's my 2 minutes, so I'll go ahead and reset the timer to 0. I will go ahead and turn. My outbound procedure turn heading is going to be 327, so I'll go ahead and do that. Time turn. Twist we'll do here in just a second because I need to bring my throttle back in as I level off at 2,100 feet. I'm established on that new heading, so I'll go ahead and start my time for 1 minute outbound. And then twist, I'm going to go ahead and twist this OBS around to a 192, which is the inbound course heading that I want to intercept as I turn back from this procedure turn outbound. When I turn inbound, that's the heading that I want to intercept. So there is 192, so I've got that all set up. So the time is going, I've done the turn, I've done the twist, the throttle is good, we're level at 2,100, and we don't need to descend again until we're established on the inbound approach course. And if they've asked us to report procedure turn outbound, we could go ahead and do that at this time that is our talking. So now we're just waiting for 1 minute to come around, and we'll turn back around to intercept the inbound approach course. All right, there's 1 minute, so go ahead and reset the timer. That's my turn. I'm going to go ahead and turn around to that inbound interception heading of 147. And then throttle, I don't need to do anything with the throttle right now. I am going to stay level at 2,100 feet until we've intercepted that approach course. So there is about 147 on the heading. So time, turn, twist. We've already got that set up for 192 for the inbound course. But that would be a time where we can double check that we have done that. And then talk, if they've asked us to report procedure turn inbound, we'd want to key up and report that at this time. We can go ahead, once we're rolled out on the heading, we can go ahead and start the timer just to give us a heads up. At about a minute or so, we should be centering up on the course, so this gives it kind of a heads up. We are 6 miles from the VOR, and remember we needed to stay within 15 miles. This gives you an idea of how much distance you're going to use up. If you're flying in the 172, flying at normal cruise speeds, and also gives you an idea, if you're flying this much faster, and this were like a 10-mile distance that you had to stay within, you would be getting a little close on that distance. 30 seconds, and the course is starting to come alive. Again, we're 5 miles from the VOR, so we don't need to turn inbound on the approach course. Super aggressively. Probably when it gets to about a dot, I'll put in that 192 heading. and that should center us up on the inbound approach course nicely. Okay, so there's about a dot, so we'll go ahead and turn over to a heading of about 192. And I just now want to track that approach course inbound. So time, I'm going to reset my timer to have it set up if I need to time the next leg of the approach. Turn, I've done that, and I'm just going to track the course inbound to the station. Throttle, I am going to go ahead and descend down to 1,700 feet. I can do that once I'm established on the approach course inbound. Again, I'll do that with a vertical speed mode and use the throttle so that I don't overspeed the aircraft or go a little faster than I want to go. And then talk, if they've asked me to advise established on the approach course, then I can go ahead and key up and let them know that I am established on the approach course. Otherwise, I'm just descending down to 1,700 feet. I continue to track this approach course inbound to the VOR, and then once I cross over the VOR, then it's time to fly the approach on in. So that's how we fly a standard procedure turn using a VOR. So the method we just demonstrated is considered the standard method of doing a procedure turn, and it's probably the most common method used by pilots, but there are other ways of doing it. You can do what's called the 80-60 method. With this method, you fly the outbound course for 1 minute, then you turn 80 degrees in the direction of the barb, then you turn 260 degrees in the opposite direction, which will put you on the inbound course heading when you finish the turn. In theory, if you use a standard rate turn, you should find yourself centering up on the inbound course when you finish this 260 degree turn. This method is quicker and works very well in a zero wind condition, but not so much when you have strong winds. Another method that can be used is called the teardrop method. With this method, you hit the fix where the procedure turn begins and turn 30 degrees from the outbound course in the direction of the barb immediately after hitting the fix. You fly this heading for 1 minute and then make a standard rate turn in the opposite direction to the inbound course heading. Again, if you use a standard rate turn, you should wind up on the inbound course as you finish the turn. While this method will save some time, it won't give you much room before you get back to the final approach fix, and like the 80-60 method, it may not work well in strong winds. You also have the option of doing a standard holding pattern or racetrack type pattern. This works well if you're arriving from a direction where you shouldn't really be going straight in, but you don't need to do a full standard procedure turn to get established on the inbound course. For example, if I'm approaching Corpus Christi, say from this direction up here, it would be a little bit cumbersome if I had to fly to the VOR, go outbound, intercept the course, and do the full procedure turn. But what I could do is just enter a holding pattern using a direct entry. So I fly to the VOR, and then I just take up the heading, make a standard rate turn around to what would be the outbound heading if there was a holding pattern established on this radial. I fly that outbound heading for 1 minute, and then at 1 minute I turn back around inbound, and that should put me on the inbound approach course. So you do have the option of doing that. And I know I'm using some terminology that is unfamiliar to some of you, but we will be going in depth in our next video on how to fly holding patterns and how to enter holding patterns. So we'll learn how that works and what that terminology means in the next video. That's not to say these methods are the only way you can accomplish a procedure turn. When you fly a procedure turn, how the turn is executed is up to the pilot, but you must follow a few rules. First, you need to stay on the protected side of the approach course. This is the side on which the barb is depicted on government charts. So in the example of the Corpus Christi approach that we have been using, the VOR to runway 18, we see the barb is pointed off to the left there, so we need to stay to the west side of the approach course prior to reaching the VOR. We do not want to maneuver off to the east. Second, we need to stay within the distance specified on the chart. This distance is usually listed in the profile view on approach charts, which again is that box at the bottom that's a view of the approach from the side that shows you the altitude constraints on the approach. This distance that you need to stay within is usually 10 nautical miles, but it can be as high as 15 nautical miles or as low as 5 nautical miles, depending on what type of aircraft most often shoot the approach. The fix from which this distance is measured is the fix that's located in the middle of the profile view and the one where the outbound course line starts. So again, in the example of our Corpus Christi approach, we'll notice in the profile view, the fix that's in the middle of the profile view is the Corpus Christi VORTAC, or the VOR TACAN. So that is where our distance is measured from, and you can see over to the far right here, which is almost always where these distances are listed, it says remain within 15 nautical miles. So in this particular approach, we need to, anytime we're maneuvering to do any sort of procedure turn, regardless of how we do the procedure turn, we need to stay within 15 nautical miles while we're doing that procedure turn. The fix where the distance is measured from is not always something you can easily measure distance from. For example, here at using the ILS or localizer runway 36 in Stuttgart, Arkansas, field identifier there is Kilo Sierra Golf Tango. We have our fix that's in the center is the TTLOM. This is the STUT locator outer marker, which is a low-powered NDB combined with a marker beacon. And of course, NDBs and marker beacons don't have distance measuring equipment. So there's no way without a GPS that we can directly measure our distance from this fix. But if we look at the localizer up here, we'll notice that it has a channel on it, which is a TACAN channel, which to civilian users tells us that this localizer is equipped with DME. And we notice that we have some distances listed down here on the bottom of the chart. And we can see that it is 4 nautical miles from this locator outer marker to this little V here, and this little V is located at 2 nautical miles. So if I add 2 plus 4, that means that the STUT locator outer marker is located about 6 DME from the localizer for this approach. So it says over here to the right that we've got that standard distance. We have to remain within 10 nautical miles of the STUT locator outer marker. So doing the math there, 10 plus 6 means as long as I stay within 16 nautical miles of this localizer DME, then I should be within that 10 nautical miles that I need to remain within while doing my procedure turn. And the final rule is that there is a speed limit on procedure turns. You should not exceed 200 knots of indicated airspeed during the maneuver, although if I were flying a procedure turn in an aircraft capable of flying that fast, I would probably fly it at no faster than 180 knots myself. That's a good maneuvering speed for aircraft that are capable of flying those types of speeds. There are a few times that you have to fly a procedure turn exactly as it's depicted rather than picking your own method. The first time is any time a holding pattern is depicted on the chart instead of the procedure turn barb. This is called a holding pattern in lieu of a procedure turn, and when you see this, you have to fly the holding pattern as depicted rather than flying any sort of procedure turn, though you only need one trip around the pattern before you proceed in on the approach. You'll also notice that some of the chart symbology on the profile view is a little different when you have a holding pattern in lieu of a procedure turn. First of all, instead of having a distance to remain within, it will tell you how long the pattern is, how long the holding pattern is in minutes. Most of them are going to be 1 minute. Some of them may be listed in miles. I haven't seen one of those recently, but I do believe those are out there. You'll also notice it has the heading for the outbound leg of the holding pattern up on the top of the course line and the inbound heading for the holding pattern on the bottom. And then on some holding patterns, you have to maintain a certain altitude while you're in the holding pattern. And so it's got that depicted with just a straight course line there. And then once you're cleared for the approach, you can descend once you're established on that last inbound leg to the holding fix, you can descend down to a certain altitude, which is depicted with this little slanted line right here. So if we're in a holding pattern, we have to stay between 6,000 and 2,100 feet. But once we're cleared for the approach, we can go ahead and once we're on that inbound leg, that final inbound leg, we can descend down to 1,900 feet and then fly the approach from there. And again, we'll be talking more about how to enter and fly holding patterns in our next lesson. Another type of procedure turn you'll see is a charted teardrop procedure, and like a hold published in lieu of the standard procedure turn barb, this has to be flown exactly as depicted on the chart as well. With these procedures, you fly over the starting fix and fly somewhere between 10 and 30 degrees offset from what would be a normal outbound course. Typically, you'll do this on a VOR radial, though it can also be done on an NDB bearing. You'll fly this segment to a specified fix, usually one you can identify with DME on the radial that you're tracking outbound on that teardrop procedure, and then you begin a standard rate turn towards the inbound approach course. In theory, you should roll out on the inbound course when you come around to that heading, but that's never quite worked out for me in the real world. So usually what I do is I'll start that standard rate turn at the fix, but I'll roll out on about a 30-degree intercept, roll out about 30 degrees early until I'm able to intercept that approach course and then start tracking that inbound. Again, with these types of procedures, the symbology on the profile view looks just a little bit different. You can see we still have the outbound course line, but it terminates now in a curve to tell us that we are on a charted teardrop procedure. And then instead of having a distance that we have to remain within, it tells us that we're on a teardrop left turn. We still have an altitude at the far end of the profile view here. This tells us that we can descend to this altitude once we are past Pine Bluff on the teardrop procedure outbound. If we have been cleared for the approach, we can go ahead and descend down to 2,000 feet. And then the next altitude that's listed underneath the flat segment here is the altitude we can descend down to once we're established on the approach course inbound. And you can see here it's not any different, but in some cases you may have a different altitude once you're established on the approach course inbound that you can descend down to. We do actually have an extra fix on this one, Raylo intersection at the 8 DME from Pine Bluff VOR. And once we reach that point, we can descend down to 1,900 feet before we descend in on the approach. These teardrop type procedures are often put in places where the aircraft is going to need to lose considerable altitude. That's why these segments are as long as they are. So let's take a look at this example out of Pine Bluff. It's the ILS or localizer approach to runway 18 in Pine Bluff. Let's assume that we're coming in from the west. You can see that the minimum altitude in this area is pretty high, 3,300 feet. Let's assume that we're at a cruising altitude of 5,000 feet. So we have quite a bit of altitude to lose while we transition onto the approach. While we're over here, ATC calls up and says you are cleared direct to the Pine Bluff VOR. Maintain 5,000 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the ILS runway 18 at Pine Bluff. So we will go ahead and fly direct to the Pine Bluff VOR, and then we will do our 5 Ts. We don't need a time because this is a DME fix, so once we reach the 12.4 DME, we know we're there. We will go ahead and turn to intercept this 022 degree radial outbound. We will twist our OBS over to 022, and then we can throttle back and descend to 2,000 feet once we're established on this radial headed outbound towards that next fix. And then if they've called and told us to request, reporting over Pine Bluff, we'll also need to remember to key up the mic and do that. So we intercept and track this 022 degree radial out to 12.4 DME, which identifies the NITA fix. At that point, we just start a standard rate turn around over to, in theory, 178. And once we roll out on that 178 heading, we should be nice and centered up on the localizer course. That does not typically work out for me, again, in real life. It never quite worked out. So what I would do is make a standard rate turn, and I roll out about 30 degrees early. So about 208 or so on the heading, and that would put me on an intercept course, a nice shallow intercept course to intercept the localizer, and we'd get on it that way. Don't forget to tune up your localizer if you don't have that on a second radio. and so that you can intercept that course. And you might, and again, do the 5 T's here. Time you don't need to do. You do need to start your turn. Twist, you need to make sure that you have the localizer up now and have that 178 course reminder in there. And again, we'll get to all this when we're talking about ILS approaches later. Throttle, if you needed to descend further, if you had a different altitude once you're established on the inbound course, that would be kind of a trigger to remember to do that. And they may ask you to report procedure turn or teardrop procedure inbound, in which case you would do that at this time as well. Once you're established on the approach course, again, if you have a different altitude here, you can descend down to that. And then once we get to 8 dB on this particular approach, we can descend down to 1900 feet where we can intercept the glide slope and fly the approach on in from there. There are some specific circumstances in which you should not fly a procedure turn. The first circumstance is anytime you're authorized by ATC to execute a straight-in approach. In the real world, ATC will generally authorize you to not fly the procedure turn and fly straight in if your course to the final approach fix is within 30 degrees of the final approach course. And this is a good rule to use for yourself in flight sim if you're not using any sort of ATC. If you're coming in within 30 degrees of the final approach course, you can just fly over the final approach fix and go ahead and turn on the final approach course without executing that procedure turn if you'd like to do that. It's important to note that the phraseology for getting cleared for a straight-in, no procedure turn approach can sometimes get confused with the phraseology for getting cleared for a straight-in approach to a straight-in landing versus a circling to land maneuver in the real world. And you can do both of those. I can get cleared for a straight-in, no procedure turn approach that is a circle to land on a different runway rather than landing straight in to the runway that the approach is designated for. For example, let's say that I'm coming in from this area into Corpus Christi. Air traffic control calls up and says descend and maintain 1,200. You're cleared direct to the Corpus Christi VOR. You're cleared for the VOR runway 8, run 8 straight in, circle to land, runway 13, or they may phrase it, you're cleared for the straight in VOR runway 18, circle to land, runway 13. And what that means is I do not need to fly the procedure turn, but they know that I am not going to land on runway 18, that I am going to circle to land on runway 13. It's very important in real life that if you are confused at all about what you're cleared to do, have that conversation with controller and make sure you're both on the same page as to what you're going to do. I'll also mention that if you're cleared for a straight-in approach and you were told to maintain an altitude until established on the approach, you can descend to the altitude listed next to the Maltese cross once you're on the approach course and within the distance specified on the chart. For example, let's assume that we are over here and air traffic control gives us a heading. They say you are 10 miles from the Corpus Christi VOR. Fly a heading of 210 to intercept the 012 degree radial. Maintain 3,000 until established. You are cleared for the VOR runway 18 straight in at Corpus Christi, or cleared for the straight in VOR runway 18 at Corpus Christi. So what we will do is take up that 210 heading until we get established on that course, and then we'll track that radial inbound. And then once we are on the approach course, we have been cleared for the approach. We need to make sure that we are within 15 nautical miles, and then we can descend to the altitude that is right there by the Maltese cross. So we can go ahead and descend down to 1,700 feet, and then fly the approach on in from there. In the real world, you should also never fly a depicted procedure turn if you're getting radar vectors onto the approach by air traffic control. And if you're flying on a segment of an approach or a feeder route onto an approach that has the text no PT on the segment you're flying, you should not fly a procedure turn. As we mentioned earlier, if you have a holding pattern depicted in lieu of a procedure turn, or you have a charted teardrop procedure, you should fly those as depicted instead of using a standard procedure turn. And then you should also not fly a procedure turn if you're flying onto the approach using a DME arc. These are usually marked as no PT. on the arc, but there are some cases that they're not marked, but this is usually when there is not a procedure turn depicted on the chart. Speaking of which, you should also not fly a procedure turn when no procedure turn of any kind is depicted on the chart. And the last instance where you would not want to conduct a procedure turn is when you're conducting timed approaches from a holding fix. This is something you really don't see anymore, even in the real world. This was more common for operations in a non-radar environment. What they would do is if there were multiple aircraft wanting to conduct the same approach to the same airport, to the same runway, they would stick all the aircraft in a holding pattern and stack them up at different altitudes. And then they would give each aircraft a specific time to leave the holding pattern and start the approach. And obviously, you would not want the aircraft doing a procedure turn. If they're doing that, you just want them to fly out of the hold straight onto the approach. So that is the last instance, and again, it's not something that you really see anymore, and it would be, difficult to conduct. I guess you could do it on your own in Flight Sim, but without ATC in Flight Sim, it's not really something that you would do. There is a handy acronym for remembering when you shouldn't fly a procedure turn, SHARP T with 2 T's. The S is for when you're authorized by ATC to fly a straight-in approach in real world, or in Flight Sim if you're within 30 degrees of the final approach course and you would like to do a straight-in instead of doing the procedure turn. H is when you're doing that holding pattern in lieu of procedure turn. Again, you're going to do that as depicted rather than flying the standard procedure turn. A is when you are flying a arc, a DME arc. R is when you're getting radar vectors. Again, that's more of a thing in the real world. P is for no PT written on the segment that you're flying in from. T is when you're flying that charted teardrop procedure. You'll, again, fly that as depicted. And then the last T is for the timed approaches from holding fixes that we really don't use anymore. If you're using a GPS to fly approaches, you can load a procedure turn in the GNS 530 and 430 from working title, which is available through the marketplace. You can do it in the G1000 NXI, which is now the default G1000 in any aircraft that has a G1000 in it. It also works, although it works slightly differently, in the GTN 750 that's available from a PMS 50. It works slightly differently on that one. You do need, if you're going to do this on the G1000, or excuse me, on the GNS 530 or 430, you do need that working title edition. It will not work in the stock unit, and you can get that through the marketplace. It's available to everyone for free. All you need to do if you want to fly a procedure turn using the GPS is load up the procedure and load the procedure from a fix where you would need to perform a procedure turn. So we're going to look at the VOR to runway 8 in Pensacola. So we're on the ground in Pensacola. I've already entered direct Pensacola into the GPS here, and then we'll go to procedures. We'll go to select approach. We will go down in and select the VOR 8. I don't know why they have 2 VOR 8s listed in here. They appear to be identical approaches. And then if we want to shoot the approach using a procedure turn, we would actually do it if we go from Pensi, we have to shoot the procedure turn or execute the procedure turn, or if we go direct to softly VOR, which is the VOR that this approach is based off of, that will load the procedure turn as well. So we'll just load that on up. We'll take off plan to take off from Pensacola, go direct to the VOR, fly the procedure turn, and come back on in. So go ahead and hit execute there. You can go ahead and load up your minimums if you want to do that now. We won't worry about that since we're not really going to demonstrate the approach. And then just hit activate, and it reminds you that this is not approved for shooting the approach. It's just for monitoring it. Since it's actually a VOR approach, we need to use the VOR to shoot that. And you can see the fixes in the flight plan are softly VOR, the procedure turn, and then softly VOR, which is your final approach fix, and then the runway 8 missed approach point. And if we look on the map, we can see we go out to softly VOR. It has the little procedure turn in here, and then we turn around and come back. Whenever you do this on a GPS, it's not going to do a standard procedure turn like we've discussed and like we've demonstrated today. You can see in this one it just does kind of a little teardrop procedure, kind of part of a holding pattern, and then comes back around. It can also do sometimes kind of a modified teardrop method where it goes out for a minute or two, and then it does basically just a teardrop turn from there. So it's not going to do the standard turn, but it will do a nice efficient procedure turn for you that will let you lose your altitude that you need to lose and get established on the inbound course with plenty of room, generally speaking. If you are wanting to fly this without the procedure turn, say if I'm coming in from the west here and I just want to fly over softly and get approved for a straight in VOR procedure or VOR approach to runway 8, I can do that. All I need to do that is come in here and click on the middle button to get the cursor active, then go down to procedure turn and then hit clear. And that will ask me, do you want to remove the procedure turn? Yes, I do. And then it just has the final approach fix in there. So if I'm coming in from the west, all I have to do is go direct to softly VOR, and then I will hit the VOR, and then I can come in on the final approach segment on into Pensacola. So that's how we load up procedure turns if we want to fly them with the GPS. This will also work if you have a GPS approach that has a holding pattern in lieu of a procedure turn. If it's one of the older approaches that does not have the fixes that allow you to not do a procedure turn, you can load it up in the GPS and it will work that way as well. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge you need to successfully fly a procedure turn in preparation for learning to fly instrument approaches. If you've enjoyed the content, please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted when new content is released. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.